In 2026, 3CR is celebrating 50 years on air.
Thanks for choosing a 3CR podcast. Throughout June, we're running our annual radiothon, where we ask you, the listener, to make a donation so that we can continue to make great radio. Your donation will help keep us community-owned and community-controlled. Go to 3cr.org.au/donate, and with that done, please enjoy the podcast.
But you also had people that were very fine people. Very fine people on both sides.
And the aliens would mind meld and give them the technology. They're bad aliens. So are you surprised the Nazis were influenced by demons?
No, if demons are real, I would definitely think they'd be on the side of the Nazis.
Yeah.
McDonald's is connected to the Clintons. They chop up the bodies and put them into the sausage and hamburgers. People are being cannibalized. Look it up.
And I'm watching CNN talk about this as violent white nationalist protests. We have done everything in our power to keep this peaceful, you know?
It's Pepe's become kind of a symbol.
Good afternoon. You are listening to Yeah Nah Passaran, a show about fascism and its gravediggers. I'm Cam Smith.
I'm Andy Fleming.
And this week we are joined by journalist Gareth Gore, the author of Opus, Dark Money, a secretive cult and its mission to remake our world. Welcome back, Gareth.
Greetings from London, guys. How are you?
Wonderful, thank you. Gareth, we last spoke to you in February of 2025. A little bit has changed since then, including there is a new pope who you recently met. Now, it seems like there should be systems in place that keep the likes of us from being this far removed from the Pope, but they've all failed. How does the Pope slide into one's DMs?
No one was more surprised than myself. I was actually on a work trip. I'm back in my finance journalism job, and I was out in Silicon Valley doing some stories about all this money that the tech companies are spending on AI. And I got a WhatsApp from someone I know saying, "Can you call me? It's urgent." And I'm like, "What is this?" And we spoke, and he told me that the Pope was keen to meet me and would I be willing to go to Rome. At which point I pinched myself and thought, just a minute, is this some kind of prank? Before realizing that, yes, this was a real deal. And so, yes, 2 weeks later, I found myself in Rome shaking hands with the big man.
And what did you tell him about your research into Opus Dei?
Going into the meeting, I really didn't know what to expect because, as you just hinted at, it's unexpected for the Pope to ask to see you. I'd basically written this book, Opus, about an enormous scandal inside the Catholic Church. And so it's the kind of thing that you wouldn't expect the Pope to normally be all that keen on being associated with. And so I went, and no one really told me before the meeting what to expect. They didn't tell me why he wanted to meet, what he wanted to talk about. And so I very much went into the meeting with my own agenda. So basically I was like, this is a unique opportunity to tell him what he needs to know. I didn't know at that point whether he'd read the book. I didn't know whether he was aware of all of these abuses that have been alleged against Opus Dei. Things like spiritual abuse, psychological abuse, emotional abuse, drugging of its members, human trafficking. I had no clue about how much of this information had made its way up to the top. And so I made it my mission to just go in there and to set aside any kind of etiquette about how you talk to the Pope or what you're allowed to discuss and just tell it to him straight. I was like, maybe they'll kick me out after 5 minutes. Maybe I'll be marched out of the Vatican. But I just have to tell him. He needs to know. And so I went in there not knowing what to expect. I launched into I wouldn't quite call it a diatribe, but I was quite firm and in terms of what I was getting across to him. And I was really pleasantly surprised. He was clearly very keen to hear all that I had to say. He had some very insightful questions. I came away actually really quite optimistic that he wants to do something about these guys and that he will do something about these guys. And yeah, very pleasantly surprised.
Gareth, what is it do you think that Pope Leo and the Church can and should do about Opus Dei?
My advice to the Pope was, and I did kind of preface this advice by saying, forgive me if you think I'm overstepping here, but look, this is what I think you should do. I think they should close the whole thing down because I think, and I was making this point that making a few kind of tweaks around the edges, forcing the group to reform will only get you so far. Because the true members of Opus Dei, they believe that the vision for Opus Dei, they believe that all of these rules and regulations that have been passed down through the generations, these rules and regulations that form the basis of abuse inside the organization, which were written by the founder of Opus Dei himself, this Spanish priest called José María Escrivá. They believe that these rules and regulations came directly from God. And by making a few tweaks and making a few reforms, all you're doing is, yes, you can say you're not allowed to do X, Y, Z anymore. But if you're a true believer and you believe that these practices were divinely inspired, you're going to carry on doing them regardless. You don't care what the current Pope says or does. You're going to carry on doing them. So I think I was trying to make the point that allowing the organization to continue to exist in whatever form is to basically risk a core set of members continuing these abusive practices, come what may. And so I think my advice to the Pope was to close this thing down. Whether or not he, heeds my advice, or whether he is slightly more careful about what he does, I don't know. But I do think that there is a risk that I don't think you can really reform this organization. I think the abuse and manipulation, the controlling practices are so embedded into the DNA of Opus Dei that it's impossible to allow them to continue in any form without risking that kind of DNA kind of continuing to dictate how the organization works.
Gareth, there's a state investigation into Opus Dei in Argentina taking place. How is that investigation faring? Yes,
so as a result of allegations that surfaced in Argentina, state prosecutors there, they launched their own 2-year-long investigation, and they basically concluded that Opus Dei had enslaved young teenage girls into the organization and then trafficked them around the world to work as kind of servants for the elite members in these residences that Opus Dei runs for. It's called numery members, the celibate members and priests. So that's currently in the early stages of court proceedings. There is likely to be a trial starting soon. At which point the public, the state has already made its conclusions quite clear. They've published quite a long report detailing the abuse and trafficking and enslavement that happened to many girls. And yes, I guess Opus Dei will have a chance to put its side to the judge, and there at some point, I guess there will be a ruling. I think that process, it's already been a couple of years. We're coming up to 18 months since they issued their first findings. And yet, I guess justice moves very slowly in Argentina. And so it could be some time before we actually have a ruling. What I do know is that case has given other women in other parts of the world the confidence to come forward. And so we've had women come forward in places like Ireland, in Mexico, and more recently, I've learned of a group of women in Italy where very similar allegations have been made that they were recruited as children. They were coerced into joining Opus Dei, and then they were turned into these slaves for the elite members and trafficked around the world. And it's starting to really gain momentum. I think it's likely that we could see similar criminal cases starting around the world as well.
Gareth, Pope Leo has made a few progressive statements that some might say in keeping with the teachings of the founder of the firm, but others have criticised him as being soft on crime. We very nearly had a different sort of Pope. I guess listeners might be familiar with the sort of papal intrigue that goes into picking a new Pope from movies like Conclave. It sounds like the reality is even wilder. Could you tell us about things like the Red Hat Report?
Yeah, absolutely. Even before when Francis was still alive and kicking, there was already a pretty concerted effort from many on the right to influence who was going to be the next Pope. I think throughout the papacy of Francis, a lot of conservative Catholics, and when I say conservative, I guess they're ultra-conservative Catholics, were horrified at some of the statements he was making about his openness to welcoming LGBTQ community back into the church and talking about blessings and this kind of stuff. The way that he was calling out the Trump administration for its policies, especially on immigration, but other things as well. And so I think there was this real concern that the successor to Francis might be someone similar. And so there was a huge effort. They piled large amounts of money into basically trying to find dirt on any progressive cardinals to try to nip their candidacies in the bud and to promote arch-conservative cardinals. That kind of failed, partly because the way the church works is that people get made into bishops and archbishops, but then the decision to make people into cardinals, so i.e. people who can elect the next pope, making people into this kind of the people who decide the next pope, is something that's decided by the sitting pope. There are the existing cardinals that were made cardinals by his predecessor, but during the papacy of Francis, he made many bishops and archbishops cardinals, many left-leaning bishops and archbishops cardinals. Coming into the last conclave was already pretty heavily stacked towards a kind of slightly left-leaning balance. And I think that these arch-conservatives, especially Americans, who poured all this money into trying to get a right-wing pope elected, they were already it was already going to be difficult. And I think they failed. Although they from reports that have come out from the conclave last year, it seems they came pretty close, actually, to having one of their own elected. But actually, Pope Leo, Robert Prevost, was the one that prevailed, of course.
Gareth, there's been a lot of discussion in recent years about the emergence of Christian nationalism within the United States and elsewhere. How would you situate an organisation like Opus Dei in relation to that ideology?
Yes, no, absolutely. They certainly fit into certain elements of that. I'm not sure movement is the right word, but that kind of trend. And they certainly agree on issues like they push things like the traditional family values. They push back on a lot of progressive kind of laws and progressive rights that have been won over the years. But I guess they differ from some of these these kind of Christian nationalists in that Opus Dei, by contrast, is an international movement. And Christian nationalism is, I think, associated with very pro-American things, especially with the kind of within the MAGA context. But Opus Dei kind of sits above that. So they participate in a lot of that, but at the same time, because they operate in other countries, I think they, I guess, tap into many of those values and many of those issues. But because they're international, they also sit above it. They coordinate efforts in other countries as well. I think what's interesting for me is the way that these Christian nationalists have co-opted faith, and in particular, in the way that they've co-opted Catholicism as a way to not only justify their message, but to almost pull people onto the bus almost. And what's been interesting for me, I think, during the first year of Pope Leo's papacy is the way that I think initially I was extremely disappointed with the way that he was moving forward. He was extremely cautious and, quite worryingly, I thought, was making quite a number of overtures to this kind of Christian nationalists and to the kind of Catholic, the way that he welcomed a number of extremely conservative cardinals in to meet him. He made a number of concessions to the traditional Latin Mass movement, which is basically one of the big things for the Catholic right. It's a way that they were horrified at the way that Francis was trying to stamp out that movement and trying to restrict their ability to do that. And it almost became a rallying point for the right. So that almost the traditional Latin Mass has almost become a flag for wider ultra-conservative politics. So the way that Leo was making overtures to them and trying to bring them back into the tent, initially it seemed that he was trying to position himself as as a bridge builder. He was trying to bring this kind of almost splintered conservative Catholic movements welcome them back into the church in a way. But I think in more recent weeks and months, he's begun to show much more willingness to take these people head on. And especially in the kind of skirmishes we've had with Trump, with Trump issuing these kind of bizarre social media posts accusing the Pope of being soft on crime and soft on foreign policy and whatever, and then saying that he was only elected because of Trump. I think the way that the Pope has stood up to that and tackled those issues kind of head on is extraordinary. It's basically the way that he's calling out the Trump administration and calling out Catholics who have allied themselves with Trump by saying that the issues of morality that they stand for and which they think are important, things like sexual morality, are actually ranked far lower in the kind of scale of morality. He was talking about how things like social justice and poverty are far more important and should be far more important for devout Catholics. I think that's interesting because I think it almost signals not only a growing confidence in him being his own Pope and not having to necessarily build bridges, but also I think it demonstrates a desire from Pope Leo to basically take back Catholicism from these people who have tried to politicize it and tried to use the faith for their own political objectives, including Opus Dei. And I think his meeting with me fits into that growing confidence. I didn't know it at the time when he invited me to see him, but I literally walked into the room and turned, and there he was ready to shake my hand. And just to our left, there were two cameramen, one taking stills pictures of us, another one making a video. And as we were meeting, the Vatican press office was putting out a statement to the whole of the Vatican press corps announcing the meeting. It's quite clear that the Pope, and he later told me that this was his decision, wanted to publicize the meeting. He wanted to publicize the fact that he was meeting with this guy who'd exposed all of this abuse inside the church that was happening inside Opus Dei. And so I think there's a growing confidence and a growing willingness to take on the way that many conservative Catholics have politicized the church for their own ends and whilst ignoring many of the kind of teachings of Christ, about the more progressive teachings of Christ, let's say.
Gareth, a recent-ish Catholic convert would be the Vice President, J.D. Vance. I understand that he has some links to Opus Dei, including his son attending an Opus Dei school. Is he in the club, or how far does their influence extend when it comes to the Vice President?
Opus Dei has basically built an extremely sizable network inside Washington, D.C. Many of the most powerful Republican figures are either full-on members of Opus Dei or at least allied to Opus Dei in some way. You've got people like Kevin Roberts, who's the president of the extremely influential Heritage Foundation, the architect of Project 2025. He's a regular at the Opus Dei Center in central DC, as are people like Leonard Leo, who orchestrated the takeover of the US Supreme Court, who helped to create the current extremely conservative majority on the court. Vance is close to Roberts. When Roberts put out a book the year before last, I think it was Vance that wrote the foreword to that. The two men are very extremely close. Whether Vance is a member of Opus Dei or not, I really don't know. Only Vance can really answer that question. But yes, we do know that he sends his eldest son to the Opus Dei school just outside of Washington, D.C. in Maryland. And he gave a speech, I think it was about this time last year at the National Catholic Prayer Breakfast, where he went out of his way to thank a couple who's very close to Opus Dei and who sit on the kind of Opus Dei school boards. He thanked them for welcoming them into the kind of DC Catholic community and for having helped them, the Vances, to find places for their kids in the schools. So we do know for a fact that Vance is kind of part of this wider Opus Dei network of influence, and that he looks up to the movement so much, he looks up to Opus Dei so much that he's willing to send his kids there and to entrust the education of his children to this extremely controversial group. Whether he's a full-on member or not, I do not know, and that's a question, like I said, that only Vance can answer.
Gareth, the book has been out for a while. It's attracted a good deal of attention, including at the Vatican, but how has the group responded to your book, and how does it generally try to manage these kinds of alleged or real scandals?
Its reaction has been quite telling, I think. Its initial reaction to the book before the book even came out was to basically hire an extremely aggressive law firm and to try to threaten and intimidate me and my publisher into withdrawing publication. They basically came after us. They threatened to bankrupt us if the book came out. When my publisher stood by me, and my publisher was extremely confident in what the book was saying, it had been through various legal reads. The lawyers had pored over the book and the evidence that I had and concluded that it was absolutely, what I was saying was absolutely valid and would stand up in a court of law. And so they stood by publication. And so when that happened, Opus Dei, having failed to threaten and intimidate us into withdrawing the book, they basically switched strategies. And then since then, the strategy has basically been to try to discredit me as a journalist. They've called me a liar. They've implied that I've been paid off by some disgruntled former member who's basically bunged me a load of cash to write this book, which is absolutely not true. And they've basically tried everything they've tried to basically sell this kind of narrative of misinformation. And I think for me that tells you all you need to know about the organization. I've been a journalist for more than 20 years. I've seen various scandals over the years. And whenever a scandal blows up, the normal reaction from a company or government or whoever is implicated is to say, oh my goodness, we're going to take this fully on board. We're going to get to the bottom of this. We're going to hold anyone that's done anything wrong accountable. We'll get to the bottom of this. We'll find out what happened. We're going to launch some big investigation or whatever. Opus Dei has not. They've done the complete opposite of that. It's quite clear, first in their intimidation tactics and then in these kind of disinformation campaign that they've launched against me in the book, that they have absolutely no interest in getting to the truth of these allegations. They have no interest in ascertaining whether what all of these victims are saying is true and whether it's indicative of a wider kind of illness across Opus Dei, which it absolutely is. The tactics are to basically protect Opus Dei at all costs. And so I think in many ways it's quite instructive, I think, for the general public to see how they've reacted, how they have declined any opportunity to really delve into these allegations and clean up. They just want to carry on. They just want to bury their heads in the sand and pretend nothing is happening and carry on as normal.
Gareth, you mentioned at the top of the show that you've been in Silicon Valley looking at big tech. Have you managed to take a break from Opus Dei, or do you occasionally find them in places where you don't expect in the Valley?
I've tried to take a break from Opus Dei. When I came into this story, I never intended to write a book about Opus Dei. I'm a financial reporter. I was sent to report on a bank in Spain, and that kind of led me to this crazy story of fraud, human trafficking, spiritual abuse. And the book, I hesitate to use this word, but I thoroughly enjoyed the researching and writing of the book. It's an incredible story, and I would encourage your listeners to go out and either buy the book or borrow it from the public library. And it is an incredible story. I had to pinch myself at so many moments. But since it came out, I've been quite keen to move on. I don't want to become that guy that kind of is only associated with Opus Dei. And so I've been writing a lot more recently about technology. But it's almost impossible to get away from Opus Dei, because whenever you pick up a rock and look underneath, quite often you find Opus Dei under there, and not least in Silicon Valley. I discovered that actually Peter Thiel, one of the great oracles of Silicon Valley, the founder of one of the big venture capital funds out there, and the guy behind PayPal, one of the early investors in Facebook, the guy behind Palantir, everyone's favorite company. And he had a long-running friendship with one of the most senior Opus Dei priests in the United States. And the two men would go for long walks in the hills around Silicon Valley and talk about the hot issues of the day. And yes, almost wherever you look, you find the presence of Opus Dei. And that's no accident. It's by design. Since the early 1930s, the founder of Opus Dei realized that if you have a political agenda to push, as this group does, it has a very reactionary agenda to push, then the way you accomplish that mission is by infiltrating the corridors of power. Since the very beginning, they've gone after people who are in positions of power, whether that's in the world of business or politics or the judiciary or education or journalism. They realize that those are the types of people that they need to draw in. Those are the people they need to recruit if they're going to have any hope of pushing their reactionary agenda forward. And as much as I've tried to escape them, if I'm a journalist writing about power and influence and money, then it's almost inevitable that I'm going to cross ways with Opus Dei again over the course of my career, I think.
I think we'll leave it there. Gareth, thanks so much for joining us. If people want to read the book, it is called Opus. It's available in Australia through Scribe, and you can check out Gareth's Substack at garethgore.substack.com. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, guys, for having me on. It's been a pleasure.
Andy, that is our show. We'll be back next week.
We'll see you then.
The Pope. The Pope. This is the Pope. Oh, you cop got mags that be dippy dope, but the whole damn nation got the same. Honey, only flock to the bee that's supporting, not the president with government lame. Put me on a slow-moving parliamentary hacking bandwagon. You can put me little ass in the grave. Every time you want it, I'll be live, bring a date. I mean computer when it's over, press save. So you can be the president. I'd rather be the Pope.
Rally to save public housing. Over 10,000 residents are set to be displaced, with 6,660 homes to be demolished across 44 public housing towers. All this in an ever-worsening housing crisis. Join us at the State Library of Victoria on Saturday the 30th of May at 11am, and then march to the Atherton Gardens Public Towers in Fitzroy as we fight to save the towers, people's homes and the communities in and around them. After the rally will be a community festival at the towers. The Victorian Labor government is determined to demolish and privatise public housing and sell off public land to developers. See you on Saturday 30th of May. Together we can stop this madness. Save Public Housing Collective is a 3CR supporter.
Sleepless Festival returns to Footscray this May, transforming Trugo Lane into a vibrant outdoor arts precinct. Across 3 days, May 15, 16 and 17, discover live music, performance, installations and visual art from emerging artists across Melbourne's west. With multiple stages, local food, bars and immersive art experiences, Sleepless invites you to gather, explore and share in Footscray's creative energy. Find the full program at sleeplessfestival.com, a 3CR supporter.